This is an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.
Hello, this is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York, and we have a distinguished guest today to discuss the question of police impunity. And I have to say that we're a bit ahead of the curve. Leo was writing about this a week or so ago, in fact, much longer ago, and none of us knew that yesterday that great radical newspaper, the New York Times, would suddenly come in and say the police unions are too strong and need containing, or that Congress would be up and down today jumping about with people who for the last few years have said whatever our boys in blue want they must have. They are now discussing reform. So this is timely, and what we're trying to explore for everybody is to what extent we can move on from protest, and we should protest and we should memorialize the victims of police brutality, but to what extent we can convert this into practical activity to end police impunity and to guarantee that if a policeman pulls his taser or his pistol or his truncheon, he has to think about the consequences, whether his pension depends on his next stroke. So these are the type of questions that haven't been asked very much. But one of those who has asked them, if I may introduce him first, is Leo Gertner, who has who's done research on this and is with the institute that looks after these things. He can explain to us, but his pamphlet was exploring the whole question of police unions, and they have popped up over and over in the last few days. The police union in Buffalo told the 57 people who walked past a man bleeding from his ear on the pavement that they would be deprived of union benefits if they didn't resign. The police union here has been defending the murderer of Errol Gardner for the last 5 years, so he's still on the force, still untouched. And this isn't just a one-off case, this is a pattern, as they say. So, Leo, do you want to kick in on this now?
Sure, Ian. Thank you so much for having me and for the Foreign Press Association of New York for hosting this really important discussion. I've been totally flabbergasted by the interest in police unions or even unions at all. Usually it's not a subject that people are racing to discuss or cover, though, in the last year things have really changed in general. Police unions are really peculiar. I guess we could call that an institution in a way, to use that phrase. They're really at this intersection between the rights that workers in the United States and through the states have to bargain for better terms and conditions of employment, and in this particular case, the interests of a third party, namely all the citizens and people in the communities that are policed. So figuring out how to reconcile those two interests is, as it turns out, extremely difficult. But the question that's really arisen in the last few days after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis is whether it's the union part in police unions or whether it's the police part in police unions that is really the problem that we're facing here. And, based on the research I've done and, the reading the last few days, a lot of brilliant commentators, it's clear that police contracts are a huge obstacle to accountability. But the way that they work really varies from city to city and from state to state, because police departments are all local. The way that they get expressed and the coalitions that are built around police contracts are very specific to cities. So here in New York, for example, we're in an interesting situation that the police contract itself is actually a pretty short document. I think it's about 30 pages, which for a public sector union contract is relatively short. And it actually doesn't say anything about discipline at all. So the issues around accountability in New York are not about the contract itself, but more this provision that we've seen a lot more discussion about 50A in state law, which prevents, which shields the identities of police officers who are accused of brutality, which I think is a clue into figuring out really what is the problem here. And I think the problem is that the police as an institution have support from the most reactionary elements in society. You know, if the problem were just unions, then we would have a lot of other things that other unions want. We would have a $15 minimum wage. We would have possibly Medicare for all. We'd have a lot more teachers. We'd have social workers. These are all goals of unions as well, but for some reason we don't have them. And I think the reason we don't have them is that the police get a lot of support. And I can say more about that later. I don't want to.
Well, you're touching on that because, of course, we're torn. We support unions and the right of workers to unionize, but in this particular case, we have to sort of come to a halt and say, but not all the way. So one of the things that the uniformed unions do across New York State is put huge money into campaigns and finance. Is this the way they've got their deal with 50A, for example, in Albany, that they're using, the police unions' war chest to get their political means that they wouldn't get through collective bargaining?
Definitely. I think we've seen that across the whole country. There are what are called, and I'm sure a lot of people have read about them now, law enforcement officer bills of rights, which create, and maybe this is a better area for Brittany to talk about since I don't know them that well, but in many states, they create sort of extra contractual super due process, if you want to call it, sort of protections that go way beyond what we ever see for ordinary people, and that slow investigations, that suppress evidence, that do all sorts of things. And those, a lot of those were put in place by police unions, though, police unions represent the majority of police officers in the country, which, if you know anything about the rate of labor union membership in the country, it's been declining precipitously in the last 2 to 3 decades, and now there's only 12% of all workers are in unions. So the fact that a majority of police officers are in unions is pretty impressive, and I think that goes back to the fact that politicians and police chiefs and police as an employer, I think they have an interest also in creating this, like what I call web of protections that includes the bills of rights, that includes qualified immunity, that includes the police contracts. So the problem to me is not so much that the police unions exist. I think that they're using unions as a formal legal vehicle to do some of the things that they would do anyway, as associations, if they could, The problem is that all these different sort of right-wing punitive forces are aligned. And really if we got rid of the police union, they would still do those things. And they do them in states where they can't unionize. So really, I think the answer that we're seeing that a lot of people are pointing to makes a lot of sense, which is defunding the unions. And now we've already seen, just in the last day and today, unions, local unions and national unions coming out and saying, with different forms of language, some stronger and some weaker, that police should be defunded. That would obviously cause some police unions to shrink or not exist, but the principal thing is to get rid of police and create those forms of services that people actually need, which we have seen in this crisis through all the essential workers who are underpaid and not unionized. Let's unionize them. Let's fund their services. Let's create unionized childcare workers, who get a living wage. Let's unionized food production, food delivery across the city and the state, you know. So it's defunding and abolishing police as we know it. I think the thing that would get us closest to dealing with the real political problem of the police.
I think we can take it as axiomatic that the people who are strongly supporting police unions at the moment tend not to support labor unions in other circumstances.
I think that's fair to say.
Brittany, can you come in? I mean, the backstop to the police unions, the procedural, you know, everything from the DA's reluctance to pick up these cases and the legal apparatus that gives them an excuse not to pick up the cases, and the difficulties of representing victims of police violence.
Absolutely. There's so much truth to what Leo is saying about what we're up against here. I think as public defenders, we've long known that it is not politically palatable, or at least hasn't been maybe until now, for politicians to take any stance that could be deemed soft on crime or anti-police officer. We've sort of built up this mythology around police officers as being heroes incapable of fault or a mistake or corruption. And it becomes this vicious feedback loop where, because we don't have accountability measures and we don't have access as citizens to these disciplinary records, it fulfills and perpetuates this notion that officers are in fact mostly doing a great job and it's only a select few engaging in misconduct. We see that with Civil Rights Law 50A. New York State is, to my knowledge, one of 3 states that gives special protections to police officers' records as opposed to other government employees or civil servants. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that as high a bar as 50A sets for disclosure of police disciplinary records, courts are going out of their way to interpret it as an even higher bar, saying that litigants need to provide some basis up front to believe that there is relevant material in the disciplinary records that they necessarily do not have access to. So we are being blocked before we even have the opportunity to look at these records. It's also important to note that, you know, even at the time that 50A was passed back in the 70s, it was not necessary. Judges in criminal proceedings already serve as gatekeepers for evidence coming into trial. Judges are already determining what is relevant and material. And so the notion that there needs to be additional protections for police officers to prevent litigants from harassing them with unsubstantiated claims, it was just never a real fear. It was never going to happen. All we're doing is preventing defense attorneys from getting access and other litigants from getting access to substantiated disciplinary complaints. An additional barrier is that, you know, when we're talking about substantiated complaints, what we're referring to is the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is supposed to be an independent body charged with reviewing complaints from the public about police misconduct. What we've seen is that that body has not had much investigative power, that it has its own biases, and that over the years, it's only substantiated about 5.2% of civilian complaints about police officers, which is far lower than what we're seeing from similar agencies across the country. So we're not even being given access to that tiny crumb of substantiated complaints that's out there. And all of these things combine to lead judges to be more skeptical of our requests for these records, to be more inclined to trust officers' version of events and testimony, and it results in more unjust convictions of criminal defendants whose cases really hang on the credibility of the officer testifying against them.
We look at the issues of the police, and one of the things that occurs to me, because I often compare similar things, if you imagine if the officers in Minnesota were Catholic priests and they had a 20-year recidivist record of molesting young choir boys, would there be calls for their records to be kept quiet?
Right.
Would they get away with it? If a young couple at 15 had sex and they would get a sex offender's record, their records would be blazoned in public. They're no harm to anybody, conceivably. And yet here we have a police officer who, as we know, effectively is judge and executioner in the present society, does not get their record blazoned in any way at all. It really doesn't bear thinking about it. But people don't take that step backwards, do they?
No, they don't. I think it's because this country has engaged in a lot of doublespeak about what pro-police means. You know, what Leo was saying earlier about this alignment of extremist sentiments with the police is deeply, deeply troubling and unacceptable. And yet it's in plain sight that this notion that police, you know, I think implicitly what we're seeing is people aligning with the police because they have supreme power over communities of color and they have impunity. And the allegiance ends up being far less about public safety or what the officer in question actually did or whether it was lawful or moral, but more so, you know, trying to preserve that power and balance, and the over-incarceration and over-policing of communities of color.
One of the pieces of sense of impunity I get is de Blasio, you know, as we know, Mayor de Blasio sort of stood on his head. First of all, thought that it was entirely reasonable that 2 police cruisers should drive into a crowd of people. Now he's thought about it and realized this doesn't make good optics. But here we are, is it a week later? And New York's finest, 36,000 police, have still not identified the people driving those cars in full public view, camera televised with lots of witnesses, and there's no sign of a suspect. I mean, this is, you know, this is like Jack the Ripper swinging from the chandeliers. Have they provided any explanations for why?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's more of what we see every time these incidents take place, that, you know, on the one hand, police departments across the country would have us believe that it's a few bad apples and that, you know, a majority of the departments are conducting themselves appropriately. But then on the other hand, these departments expect us to accept silence in the face of outright violence, misconduct, criminal activity. And how can both be true? How can we give any moral absolution to officers who stand by and watch these things happen and don't say anything? This is yet another indication that this is a deep-seated structural problem and not a matter of individual people going off on, you know, their own adventures. This is an attitude toward poor and Black and brown communities that has infected police departments across the country. And that, combined with the complete lack of oversight, is only going to bring out the worst in people. We know that when people are given, as a matter of human psychology, we know that when people are given power without accountability, it is corrupting. And so it's beyond me why we can't, as a country, come to an agreement that there needs to be some more transparency and accountability for officers who have so much power and who wield weapons that could take a life away in an instant. Why is accountability so threatening?
Well, you've also touched on the omerta, I call it, the fact that they're not going to riot. I've had a friend who was a policewoman during the Toxteth riots in Liverpool, and just afterwards we were talking about it, and she's saying, when it was terrible what people were doing, I said, well, are you admitting that would you admit that some of your colleagues are outright racists? Oh, she said, oh, yes. I said, would you denounce them for it? She said, oh, no. I said, well, you can't complain when the brick that was meant for them hits you.
Yeah.
Which was my standard answer on this. You stand by them, you take the consequences, evil though they may be. We have a question from Frank Gomez about, which really we should be getting to. What pressure can be exerted to reform the press? You know, moving on from expressing indignation, which we should do, and it's therapeutic, and it certainly had effects because the outpouring of indignation has already sort of moved the iceberg to some extent. So what can the average citizen do to get reform? I mean, what are the best channels? Through the city council, through the state, through Congress, or all of the above?
Well, I mean, I think it will absolutely be a multi-pronged effort. I think I think constituents calling their local legislatures and assembly persons and voicing their support for, in New York, the repeal of 50A and any similar privacy provisions that exist in other states. I think pushing for, the Black Lives Matter campaign has articulated all of, many record and science-based proposals for reforming the criminal justice system. I'm just listing things that have been out there.
Well, we're expecting Hawk Newsome to come and join us at some point soon. He's due to pop up any moment. So he might have some more. Leo, what about your, looking at it from the side of your specialty, looking at the police unions and their power, what can be done?
Yeah,
I mean, how can we attack them without attacking all unions? And how can we say defang them without weakening all unions, for example?
Right. I think that's the $64,000 question that we're all wondering, especially as we've already seen a lot of attacks from the right wing and from pro-business groups trying to seize this moment sort of cynically to attack unions and saying that, not just police unions are out of control, but teachers are out of control, firefighters, essentially everyone. There's an article in Reason magazine, which is a libertarian magazine, calling for the busting of police unions. The Boston Globe editorial board wrote an op-ed saying that police unions are the problem, which they are, as I explained, but I think that I don't think anyone really has the answer, but we're already seeing other parts of the labor movement mobilizing quite quickly, given how slow things can be to change in the labor movement, since it's a collection of over, 15, 20 million members across multiple groups, at least in the AFL-CIO. There are many different groups already calling for disaffiliation of police unions from the AFL-CIO, the National Federation of American Unions. One problem is that there's only one real police union in that federation. Many of the police unions are independent. The Fraternal Order of Police is independent, but the International Union of Police is in the AFL-CIO, and they have about 100,000 members. Writers Guild East today called for them to be disaffiliated from the AFL-CIO. There is a campaign called No More Cop Unions by research and other staff at unions who tend to be on the younger side. So there's a little bit of a generational and ideological split going on within unions too, that we've seen, play out across different areas too, with the election, the 2020 election and back to the 2016 election. We're seeing that same thing here. I think younger people and tend to feel like you can be both anti-police and pro-union, but there's an older generation that's lived through a lot of anti-union attacks that is a little more reflexive in defending police unions because they are unions. And I think we're just going to see that play out. I think one thing that we haven't talked quite as much about, though, I just saw a Quartz article online about it, is how police settlements are paid. Usually police settlements for brutality are paid by the city or the state or the government, and none of the liability has been placed on the police themselves, either as agencies within government or even the individual officers, if what they do is deemed to be outside the scope of their duty. I think that's an interesting solution that we can start to look at, and it's actually something that I think that the labor movement can probably also think of how to put in contracts, or recommend that it be placed in contracts, some sort of allocation of liability that doesn't hurt communities, and I think that is something that we have seen in non-police union contracts is a concern with the effects of government actions on third parties. You know, actually, I think in Minneapolis itself or St. Paul, the teachers union put in their contract, negotiated that the police could not, or that the city and financial institutions could not evict students if their homes were in foreclosure or their back rent or stuff like that. So I think there are a lot of creative solutions that the labor movement can come up with. We've come up with them in other situations, and I think
we've been joined by Hawk Newsome now from Black Lives Matter. Hawk, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks for coming. We've been discussing, you know, Leo has done a study on police unions and their effect, and with Brittany, we've been discussing both the institutional objections at the DA level, the 50A, and the other obstacles to trying to against accountability for the police. And we're discussing what can be done to what's feasible to take advantage of this. Not take advantage is perhaps the wrong word, but to channel this current justifiable outrage into concrete political terms where the police impunity and infallibility is questioned. Do you have any suggestions? I understand that the movement has thought about this, and you've got papers.
Well, yes. I mean, first and foremost, we'd like to abolish the police and allow communities to police themselves. Secondly, a lot of the talk around the movement is to defund the police, and I know that's happening in Minnesota. Also, there's talks with our mayor here in New York City, who is Bill de Blasio, who's completely useless. He's making an attempt to do that to pacify people, but it's easy for the Democratic Party and the media to maintain the status quo and say, okay, this is about policing. Not necessarily. Police are just the enforcers of anti-Blackness. And if we're going to talk about really changing society, starting with policing, then we have to address the police. Black Lives Matter Greater New York came up with a bill. We actually held a rally in Times Square yesterday. The mayor heard that we were coming and he closed off Times Square to all pedestrians, right? So that we couldn't have Times Square. So we moved about 30 feet outside of Times Square and set up speakers and had maybe 15 or 20,000 people out there. But what we were announcing was a blueprint, right, for us to move forward, which entails the Black Act. And we wrote about 8 pieces of legislation. The first piece of legislation being the I Can't Breathe Act, which someone who's completely unbiased and rational would say, hey, you know, that just makes sense to do. And what that looks like is if a person is in medical distress and they either, and the police observes this and they say something like I can't breathe or I need help, then the police officer should call for medical assistance immediately, should disengage and call for medical assistance immediately. And if that police officer does not do this and the individual is injured, then that police officer would be facing a Class A felony. And if the person dies, he'd be facing a murder. He or she would be facing a murder charge. I spoke with the governor a few times last week, and I asked him to enact the I Can't Breathe Act, and he turned around and he gave us some good things, but he turned around and gave us something. He just banned chokeholds. Like, it's nonsensical because chokeholds are banned in many police departments, many, even in New York where Eric Garner was choked to death. It was banned even then, and the officer was trained not to use it even then. But what we face is a Republican Party who has a disdain for Black people and a Democratic Party who doesn't really want to enable or empower Black people. and this is highly problematic. So, this is the Foreign Press Association, right? And people who are on the outside of America and less susceptible to the pressures that a lot of media outlets here would face, then I would say evaluate the I Can't Breathe Act and our whole legislative agenda, and talk about it. Start a discussion, and I'm sure you'd come to the same conclusion that I have, that it's a must do.
Now, under Old English common law, any citizen, not just a policeman, who sees somebody in distress, liably dying, walking past, it's the sort of reverse Good Samaritan. It's called a misprision of felony.
Wow.
Under English common law, you could be prosecuted if you walk past somebody who is obviously in distress and you did nothing. If a policeman is almost an accomplice to it, it's not just a misprision, it's an actual taking the felony, as you say.
Absolutely, it's a malicious act.
But we have exceptional things because, of course, the history in this country of hundreds of years of the police being used to catch slaves and break strikes.
Absolutely, and that's the police. The police, as we know it, was founded to capture Black people and return them into bondage. That's the slave patrols. This is our reality. Policing has been racist and anti-Black in this country since its inception, and now people are offering us moderate change instead of radical change, and it just reaffirms the fact that they want to keep us as second-class citizens. The second piece of legislation that we put forth was the Blue Wall Law. Now, we have something called a blue wall of silence where police officers don't snitch on other police officers. Police who report other officers for breaking the law are subject to scrutiny from their peers. They're bullied by their peers, and they often don't get promoted or they get pushed out. And this is the culture. So to break that culture, what we're saying is if a police officer does not, I repeat, if a police officer does not tell the truth about incidences in their reporting, if they intentionally falsify a document, then they should be charged and jailed, and most importantly, they should lose their pensions. Mm-hmm. Right? And then it becomes a decision of, okay, you're another cop who beat the crap out of someone. You just broke the law. And if I cover for you, then I'll lose my pension, my family's security, I might lose my home, and I'll lose my liberty, I'll lose my freedom. This just makes sense to me, right? Because either two things are gonna happen. One of two things are gonna happen. Either there's going to be an all-out revolt with bloodshed in the streets, which no one wants, or two, they're gonna start putting cops in jail.
What would you say? I mean, a lot of the apologists for the police will say it's just a few bad apples. I mean, apart from saying that a few bad apples in a barrel will rot the lot, what is your counter to that?
We've seen, in the last 5 years, we've seen too many police brutality videos, police violence videos. And I can't remember one time a police officer, one of these so-called good cops, stopped one of these so-called bad cops from hurting someone. So where are all these good cops they talk about when George Floyd is being choked to death?
Well, allegedly, one of the younger cops there did remonstrate, but he was 2 days on the job and it was his training officer doing the choking. That was one report I read. No, it's your major point is there. It's the sense of impunity and the fact that there's no penalty for going along with abuses of human rights. I mean, I saw it, was it the New York Times? One of the excuses was he was just obeying orders. These people have no sense of history. That was what they said in Nuremberg just before they were hanged.
Yes, so were the Nazis. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good
literally
point.
What they said. It was a direct quote. He was just obeying orders. And I mean, I never say it without a heavy German accent. I was just obeying orders. It was a lousy excuse then. It's a lousy excuse now. I was brought up on war comics. I know about this.
You're a lousy human being. you look at everybody. You had one day, one of the police chiefs, Moynihan, here in the NYPD, he was shaking hands and hugging people. And the next day, he watched his officers hitting people in the head with walkie-talkies. He watched his officers beating and brutalizing and pepper spraying innocent, peaceful people. It's so hypocritical, and this is why, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement needs the media, right, to help us tell our narrative, because the police spend millions on public relations and they're very good at it. So it's good that we have the opportunity to tell our side. Thank God for social media, because they can't shut those videos down, even though the nights before marches, they'll jam up my phone. I'm quite sure that, you know, they listen to our phone calls and things of that nature, but it's really, really, really tough. It's really tough to just break through that. And part of it is because of police unions, as the gentleman had spoke about earlier. Police unions are cops here. And you have police that are rapists. You have police officers who are busted for running coke with El Chapo. You have police unions who jump out in front of the news and in a real self-glorifying type of fashion, and they grandstand and they defend officers who commit heinous acts. I don't see any other union doing that, right? I don't see the what is it here? The bus drivers, transit workers union, TWU. They're huge and powerful in New York. When a bus driver might get drunk and plow through a crowd of people, you won't see their officials every day at trial advocating for this bus driver, but you'll see that with police unions every day at trial. They encourage other officers to come in uniform to intimidate the jury. I was told one time that I couldn't wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt because of the impact that it would have on a jury, but there were 30 cops in full uniform on the other side of the courtroom. So I wrote a letter to the Daily News, and pretty much those cops were banned from wearing their uniforms in the courtroom unless they absolutely had to be there.
Well, when you look at de Blasio the other year, when he was doing the right thing about stop and save, and you had basically the uniformed police were having a political demonstration at a funeral, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
They turned their backs on him. I mean, this was how much of that pressure, which, by the way, in most other circumstances in uniformed forces would be called mutiny. They'd all be fired. Possibly if they were in the army and they did that, or any of the other uniformed services. But they did it. And far from de Blasio sort of, how should we say, reprimanding them for it, he seems to have accommodated them. And I think that probably played a significant part in his supine views over the last few days.
Absolutely. He justified police officers running over a crowd, but I heard someone trying to speak. I'll give them space.
Brittany?
Oh yeah, I was just going to add that, you know, I read an article this week referring to this dynamic as a protection racket. We're seeing an environment where elected officials across the country are afraid to reform policing, are afraid to speak out against misconduct committed by the very forces that are supposed to be serving us. We've entered this new normal where everyone is afraid to demand accountability from police departments. And keep in mind that these incidents that we're seeing on tape are only a small fraction of what is actually taking place. How often does someone actually manage to have a video camera out that isn't smashed before the tape is released to the public? You know, we also have a system where the police are largely responsible for investigating claims of misconduct against their own officers. A certain selection of complaints are referred to the CCRB, but a great majority are investigated internally by the Internal Affairs Bureau in New York. And the way that works is that the complaint comes in through the IAB and it trickles down to the officer's precinct supervisor. So someone who works with that officer is the one tasked with judging whether they engaged in misconduct. We don't hear about those incidents.
Could you suggest to replace that? A sort of, a KGB smash squad to go after police?
I mean, I think we need complete transparency. I think the CCRB has been hamstrung by a lack of resources and investigative power. We need a new civilian-ran agency that has complete access to IAB records, that has funding to conduct their own investigations, and those results, those findings need to be immediately published to the public, not only turned over if someone happens to submit the perfectly worded FOIL request. This needs to be from the jump available to everyone.
So,
if I can jump in, Brittany, thank you. You are speaking the gospel right now. I just left a rally for an elected civilian complaint review board. What she was saying, I mean, she said it perfectly. Our civilian complaint review board is appointed by the mayor and other political cronies. And when they evaluate cases and send it back to the police chief, he declines to prosecute or take action on 60% of these cases. Now, once again, this, the Elected Civilian Complaint Review Board is something we've advocated for. That's part of our Black Act. These are laws that make sense to most people who are on the ground, that, the politicians and their political activists will be against, because they're too radical, and people seek moderate change. But the sister said it perfectly. We need an elected civilian complaint review board. That way people will have to run for a seat to represent the people and investigate police wrongdoings.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I agree with what Brittany and Hawk said. I also think that incentives have to be taken away from prosecutors for being weak on police violence, and for being too zealous and abusive in going after people for petty crime, if you can even call it that. I mean, like Hawk said earlier, police have no problem breaking the law, and they're not prosecuted for it, and there's no greater, you don't see solidarity around the commission of a crime like you see with the police. The incident that we saw in Buffalo is extremely revealing, with all 57 officers in that tactical unit resigned just because questions were going to be asked about what happened to a...
They resigned from the tactical unit. Picking up Hawk's point of view, if this was a real disciplined force, why didn't their superior officers say, "Hey, we pick which units you're in. You're fired if you don't report for work"?
But a lot of the prosecution doesn't come because prosecutors also have something to gain by being weak on law enforcement officers. I mean, I think one of the most revealing stories that we had out of George Floyd's tragic murder is that Amy Klobuchar had something to do at some point with not prosecuting the officer who crushed his head and didn't allow him to breathe. I don't think anyone was forcing her hand or any other prosecutor's hand. Yes, maybe there were campaign funds that helped, but like Brittany was saying earlier, there's this whole tough on crime mentality, which is deeply rooted in anti-Black racism in this country. And the Prison Policy Institute, I was just reading earlier today, has a great report from a couple of years ago just showing how many politicians at the executive level in states and also nationally in the legislature, including Jeff Sessions, were prosecutors at one point. And I think we have to look much more critically at who we elect and what their backgrounds are. Because those are ultimately the people who make the laws. And if they are, if they believe, or if they're going to side with a police officer more than with a victim of police brutality, we need to know that.
What was coming to an outsider's perspective? I was brought up in Britain, in a rough port city, Liverpool. I was involved in several riots, nose to nose with the police. And I never saw the level of gratuitous violence and indiscipline that I saw here in New York from the police force. I've never seen the sort of pure sadism with which they were molesting demonstrators, hitting them while, I mean, okay, they were worthy opponents, the police. You know, they'd occasionally use their truncheons. They weren't armed in Britain. But mostly it was pushing and shoving, and there was even some good-natured badinage across the lines as we're heaving to and fro across the shield wall. But never did I see, well, very rarely did I see complete berserker behavior like we've seen on the streets of New York. I mean, most of those people are clearly unfit to be in any civilian police force.
I mean, realistically, I've worked for a prosecutor's office, and you know, I clean up well, and I'm in a suit and tie, and I'm a paralegal, and then I went on to work in the community affairs unit, and these police would talk to me and brag about how they beat up anyone who ran, and that what they didn't realize where they were talking about my friends, you know, people I grew up with. I'm from the Bronx. I represent the Bronx in a lot of fashions, and this is just their culture. and we have this fantasy about making these people out to be heroes. They're not heroes. They're human beings. Most of them are action junkies anyway, who are looking for the next head to bust or the next shootout or some action. Like, I have no affinity for the police. I have no sympathy for the police. And because times are what they are, somebody's going to lash out against the police. Okay, and what I need America not to do is fall into the trap of feeling sorry for all cops just because somebody killed a cop. I don't condone violence unless it's in the form of self-defense, but this is what's going to happen, and the unions are going to jump out there and say, see, it's all this anti-police sentiment, and the liberals are kowtowing, the liberals are bowing down to the activists, and it caused this officer to get hurt. That's exactly what's going to happen. So we must prepare strategies and talking points to counteract that narrative. It seems insensitive, but let's be realistic. There is a war on Black people in America, and there is no time to be sensitive in war.
Well, one of the hopeful things about the moment is the police polls show that the great American public are actually more upset about George Floyd than they are about the alleged riots. That's what the polls are indicating. So this seems to be the cusp of events where if you guys can get a campaign and act together, we might be able to achieve some concrete reforms with popular support. Well, what do you think about that? Is there a chance?
We actually have an act. It's called blackopportunities.com. It's on blackopportunities.com. It's the only thing sitting on this site, so people don't have to search for it. And it has legislation that covers a wide span of things, from jobs to housing to Black entrepreneurship to defending ourselves against the police. So it's there. It's there for them to find it if they want to. But, like, you know, I'm tired of this. Is one of the reasons why Nick Cannon and myself founded Black Opportunities last week. And it's because we're tired of asking the government to do things for us. So we'll protect our communities from the police. We'll teach our children about financial literacy. We will feed our people clean food and show other people in the community how to duplicate these actions. So you know, for us is, yeah, we'll fight because we need to take back what America owes us, but at the same time we have to build up our own communities and look towards Black sovereignty within the confines of the United States of America.
But how does that work? You're in a city with a critical mass of Black people and large enough Black communities to do that. Most Black people are scattered across the country in small enclaves, isolated. What can we do to protect them?
We're teaching people how to organize, right? All it takes is a few. Right, 5 to 10 people who come together, share a common doctrine and set of beliefs, and are willing to take actions. And that group of people can mobilize a whole community. It's not that we're outsmarted, overpowered. We're just out organized. We have to teach our people how to organize.
But this has happened in the past, and there have been whole Black communities that have been wiped out and genocided off the face of the map in the southern states in the past.
In the words of one of our founding fathers, Patrick Henry, give us liberty or give us death. I'd rather
Was that
die
before
like
or
a
after they
man.
sold his slaves?
I'd rather die on my feet like a man than die on my knees like a coward.
Brittany, you look as though you're about to say something.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I completely support and appreciate everything that Hawk has been saying. I also think that this is a moment in American history that's long overdue, where, you know, I've seen it in my own circles, people who have, it's why it's important in this moment to broaden the conversation beyond police brutality and to talk about this country's history of anti-Blackness and anti-racism, and to capitalize on the platforms we have to put the onus on white people to educate themselves and to educate their family members and their colleagues about these issues, because people of color are not the experts in racism. White people in this country are. White people have been the arbiters of racism, and white people need to take ownership and agency in fixing this problem and in re-educating the people around them. And I have seen a shift that I didn't see previously, where people are making time to read the words of Black authors and to view Black art and to understand the experiences of the people around them that previously they relied on their privilege to ignore. Because at the center of all of this is this presumption of Black deviance and Black criminality. And it's not until we pull that up and show it for what it is that we're going to break out of this cycle. So long as people in this country view Black people as deviant, we will wind up in situations where government power is used to oppress. We have to reach a new status quo where Black people are given their due and treated as equal human beings.
Well, you have one of the things I didn't think got nearly enough attention as they should have done is how lip service can be paid. The dog walker in Central Park, I noticed she used politically correct terminology. She called the police and said, there's an African-American man. She couldn't bring herself to use any of the traditional words that she would have almost certainly be thinking. She phrased them in a nice liberal, how should you say, you know, sensitive way. But the effect she was calling was every bit as dire. So how do you get over the fact that a lot of people out there who will pay the lip service, who will genuflect and say, of course, we're not racist, or they're not racist. However, we should really let things go pretty much as they are.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll let you speak, Leo, but I would just say in short that we have to begin centering these conversations around impact and not intent. There are too many well-intended people doing awful things. It doesn't matter that you didn't mean to cause harm if ultimately you did. And if we can create more, in our communities more broadly, a less focus on this adversarial punitive system and a greater focus on restorative justice and accountability and understanding the impact of your actions across the board, not even wedded just to racism, just creating a sense of collective responsibility to each other, then I think we begin to move the needle there, and we are talking less about the right words and more about the right actions.
Leo, we're coming towards the end.
Yeah, I agree with everything Brittany said. I think one issue, and I think that's come up, is community control of the police. And I think we really have to explore what that means and how it can be achieved. Ultimately, I think this is about, in a certain way, sovereignty. You know, Black communities should have the right to control themselves and build their wealth and build their power in this country, and that is what has been taken away. And I think when police unions sort of came up in the 70s, sort of the more modern contemporary, their more contemporary existence, there were attempts to form them earlier and they were broken. But in the 70s, a lot of that was in reaction to attempts to create community control of the police. If you read historical records, I think most recently I read a 2005 journal article by a Stanford law professor that talked about the defeat of a community police effort in Berkeley that was, cast in very racist ways. So I think we have to really start thinking about what it means for people to govern themselves and not allow establishment powers, elites, corporations, however you want to phrase it. And I think we're really at a turning point. In Colorado and Denver, folks sued because the police was using tear gas and chemical weapons and all these things against the protesters. And, an old judge, a 70-something-year-old judge who was appointed by President Obama, said, you can't use these things, and you can't smash somebody's head to protect Starbucks from getting destroyed. Like, property is not more important than people. And I think more people are starting to recognize that. And I think a lot of the laws in this country and a lot of the police forces were established to protect property. And of course, that goes back to people being property as well, but has evolved towards policing the inequality, which is disproportionately on Black people. And so I think we're seeing a real shift with all these narratives. And somewhere in the middle are unions, and that is a problem that the union movement, I think, is trying to sort out now. But I think the bigger issue is organizing people to oppose this, like Hawk was saying. And I think political education at the end of the day, also as Brittany was alluding to, is the most important antidote to this kind of thinking. And it's the long road and it's the harder road, but it can be done.
Hawk, do you want to wind up the discussion?
Time has come. We all know what the problem is. We can't tiptoe and tap dance around it any longer. Why? Because our people have finally awoke and our people are finally rising up. So either give us our justice or prepare for mass uprising. I believe that George Floyd's death has caused about $70 million, maybe give or take 10 million, since he died, $70 million in property destruction. And I think that the government should really think about that every time they think about killing another Black person. Every time that there's an injustice, if people take to the streets like they did in the 1960s, things will change. This country was on fire. There was mass looting, mass riots, whatever you want to call it, in the 1960s. That's when we had the highest rates of growth in wealth accumulation, real estate development. Would you have the voting rights, the Civil Rights Act? Like, we got a lot of progress when we was tearing this country apart. And the fact that police are being prosecuted or fired across the country for missteps just reaffirms like what America responds to. So yes, we have to organize the people, and I'm not telling people to go out and riot, but apparently this is what this country respects.
Okay, this is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York, and we have had a stimulating panel with Brittany Francis, Leo Gertner, and Hawk Newsome, who different aspects of the same problem of police impunity, and some fairly clear tram lines laid out for where we should go from there. I'd like to thank you all very much, and I hope we...
And Brittany, you're a dope queen. Keep up the great work.
I didn't realize you had such a...
Thank you so much.
Right on.
If you want to advertise your book, this is an appropriate time to do it. No? Okay. We will put it out on our list if you get the details to us. Once again, thank you very much indeed. And let us hope that we see light at the end of the tunnel and it's not New Jersey in flames. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. To learn more about our digital forums and programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For membership information, please visit www.foreignpressassociation.org and on Twitter at FPA New York. This has been an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.